They go into the way we use our bodies, for example. So it's not just a question of something in the mind. Unfortunately, we get caught with this mind-body dichotomy. This mind-body dichotomy itself is a colonized idea. There is no such thing as the mind-body dichotomy if you look at it from the Indic points of view. Yeah. So the first big jolt that I got, which awakened me to this whole question of colonization and so on, was my meeting with Dharampalji just when I was out of college. So he asked two questions. There was a small group of us out there, and he said, you know, you've done your IIT and all this kind of thing. You've got your degree. How are you going to use this knowledge to make India a great country? Are you going to do this by running behind the tails of the West? Yeah. Then the second question he asked was, supposing we take it for granted that the current narrative that we as Indians are one of the poorest nations, all of this, because we are Indian, what are you going to do? Are you going to lobotomize your brain and put an American brain out there? What are you going to do? Then he said, the only way, if you're really serious about this question, is to go and study what is really Indian and find out. So he encouraged some of us and he said, if you're really keen on it, go study with a master for at least 10, 12 years. And he also said, don't study in order to glorify what is Indian. He said, go and study and find out what there is in our tradition and our continuity that is relevant for today's issues. If it cannot solve contemporary problems, why are we hanging on to it? Yeah. So then I went and studied for 12 years or so with Krishnamacharya. I'm hoping many of you know who he is. If you don't know, that's very unfortunate. And my wife Sashi studied with Ganapati Stapati for many years, and then Balu went and studied Vriksha Ayurveda. There's a lot of us who went in and did some deep study. So the outcome of that is going back, really understanding what, you know, the Upanishads mean and things like that, and not this empty glory of saying, yo, we had this Upanishad, we had this, we had that, and to see what there is in those things. And it's incredibly profound. But you also see, when you study with a master like this, how much of our books have been Radha Krishnanized. Okay. So if you read the Bhagavad Gita translation of Radhakrishnan, profound English or whatever, great English, but he has to justify every other stuff that he writes, saying, you know what, this is what is found in the Bible, this is what is found in something or the other, constantly justifying what is Indian through anchoring it in what is in the West. Yeah, and so on. So when you look at it deeply, this is a shocking kind of a thing that you find, and it's so prevalent that most of us don't even think about it twice. Yeah. The other experiences I've had is actually working with Dalits and groups like that. And I remember this very, very clearly at the end of a week-long lab with the Dalit group, and some of the stuff that we went through there is the most difficult lab I've ever been through, to really listen to the kinds of violence that they encounter and what happens. the last day, one of these guys sings a Sanskrit song and said, "This is the song of Nachiketas. Can you tell me the meaning of this song?" Okay. So I told him the meaning and all that, and he says, "Why have you people kept it away from us for so long?" Okay. So then it's, this whole thing has been very, very critical for me, because it told me how I am part of the oppressor. I'm not just the oppressed, because there are lots of stories of me being oppressed and this, that, and the other. That's a reality that came through to me very strongly. And then, of course, there are politics of the place, and Tamil Nadu has thrown up lots of things. One of the things I realized is, for most of us, we don't wake up to these questions of how deeply our belonging shapes our thinking, how the context of where we study shapes our thinking, until we are confronted with something. Yeah, for me, my belonging, my being a Brahmin or so and so doesn't matter a damn usually. I'm not thinking about it at all. Until somebody comes and says, "Paparappayale," in Tamil, it means you bloody Brahmin bastard, you've done this. So then I remember, oh my God, yeah. I belong to this. Yeah. Or I remember another story. Last week, I was with the whole family gathering. So all my relatives were there. So I remembered all kinds of old stories. So there's one particular confrontation I had with an aunt of mine who, quotes the Vedas and this and that very often. And every now and again, she'll come up with this statement about the greatness of Brahmins. So I turned around and told her, you know what, you're not a Brahmin at all. There is no such thing as a Brahmin. We are either Brahma Bandhus, which means somebody in our family at some point of time is supposed to have really gone after truth and really said, I will try and discover the process of walking on the path of truth and so on and so forth. We are at best Brahma Bandhus, if you follow the Upanishads properly. And even there, if you listen to Shankaracharya, we are karma chandalas or karma vaishyas or karma something else. So can we drop this stupidity? Yeah. So we all carry many of these ideas and things like that without examining them. And I think it's extremely important to examine it and examine it very honestly. Yeah. And if we really want to make a difference to ourselves and the country and our civilization, we really need to examine this very, very carefully. So that's what we've done for the last few years, and we'll present what we have found. And this is just a triggering point for many of you, because it requires a lot of inner work, really. Yeah, to really touch what is going on requires a lot of honesty, not easy at all. Yeah. So that's my brief introductory statement.
Okay. Let me come in and talk about my association with this work. I guess when you are born to a family, many things are assigned. Your location, your religion, your context. And so I inherited a lot of things. Growing up, I think I must admit that I was very westernized in the choices of books I read, the schools I went to, and the kind of religion that I had as a Roman Catholic. I think the distinctiveness of some of that came through initially when there used to be this catechism classes versus the rest of the students would go away and get tucked out into moral science and so on. So in the periphery, juxtaposed in growing up, there always has been a kind of distinctiveness uh, that I experienced. I'm not saying distinctiveness as in better or worse, but just a feeling within that one was quite different. Uh, but as you grew up, I realized there was a larger context in which many things did add up. There were contradictions, polarities, dilemmas around this and that, choices one had to make. I think very recently, and I say recent, about say 11, 12 years back, at a NHRD conference, an American speaker was talking to 1100 CHROs and HR people about leadership. And as is usual in such HR conferences, somebody murmured something about the Indian leadership and how we need to embrace an Indian model. Obviously, it had a lot of currency. Everybody sort of joined in noisily, saying, yeah, absolutely. And then the speaker turned around and said, would some of you, one of you, come up and just explain this Indian leadership model? There was a stunned silence, like as they say, the pin drop silence. I was squirming. Nobody got up. Somebody finally got up, went up on the stage, said a few things. I don't know what he spoke about. But for me, that moment was a moment of epiphany. I realized that I had lived a significant part of my life being like a Hamlet, to be or not to be, like in an NCPA theater, but with an Indian audience in an Indian stage, pretending I'm Hamlet. And that moment, someone called out to me and said, Steve. And I awakened to the fact that I, Steve, am being Hamlet. During the tea break, in the weeks that followed, I checked in with a lot of colleagues to ask them, what do you mean by Indian leadership? What are the models we have? And they didn't seem to know anything that was substantive. And yet we take pride that we follow an Indianness about us, but we know not what it is. And that's fairly significant, is that there's an awareness that we are particularly distinctive with our own context, but we know not what it is. And that's where I started this journey of going into indigenous literature, reading as much as I could, the stuff that Raghu said that he did years ago. For me, it was a very recent journey. And as I went with snorkeling on the surface of the ocean, I saw below rich treasures of what Indianness means and what personal leadership means and what is it. And we know it not. And then to my horror, also discovered that our history has been written with ethnocentric foreign lenses, fairly distorted. And much of what we hold as a dominant narrative, in its true sense, is alien to us. I recognize that we are actually at a sangam today. You, me, all of us. A confluence of a 7,000 years living civilization with its unique Kal, Desh, and Patra, but born in a postmodern world where we look longingly at the affluence of the West and deeply wishing, can I have some of that? And in that Western and Indian orientation that exists in both our minds, there's always within us a contradiction, a polarity, a way in which we have to reconcile the differences that come up for each one of us. Our modes of feeling, thinking, acting seem to be locked in patterns, some of which belong to us and some of it which needs to be unlocked in order for us to make sense. I think quite recently with the DOBD program, I got exposed to the framework and then joined in to work deeper, both on online and in face-to-face. And it's been, for me, a never-ending learning in terms of the unfolding. So that's my journey, a process of understanding for myself. And a year back, I moved to Goa. And as I started to unpack some of the elements of how Goa historically arrived to where we are today, that again has been a tremendous insight and an upheaval with which I engage with today. So I'll just pause here for a moment. Yeah.
You want to add something, Ankit, before we do some broad and so on?
I can share some bit of my journey into this. I think I've been working in the social development space of India for the last 10 years. I've been instrumental in setting up 3 large organizations. And a lot of my training on how to set up organizations, what change I want to bring into the world has been Western. I grew up in a home where my parents would give me very intercultural understanding of the world. My father would teach me Mahabharata, and my mother would tell me stories from the Sikh history. And I go to a school where I'm studying science and moral science and history in a certain way. As a kid, it never matched up. It never my world was very fragmented. When I started working in this social sector, I realized there's always a change which is thrusted upon people. So this whole process of I know how somebody should change. There's an outside, everything is driven from the outside. Did not really quite match with what I learned from my parents early on. And the sad reality was I would see the next generation, even my sister who's 9 years younger to me, didn't really get all that from my parents, right? The education system took on a different turn, and my understanding and my training in the world took a very different turn. And I'm still in this process of reconciling. I'm still in the process of unlearning a lot of these mental models, which I will say corrupted my mind, right? I would say uh, don't really make sense, but I also feel entrenched. And this whole process of decolonization, which I was introduced through this process of difficulty of being dharmic, um, has been very influential for me in my work. It has helped me in seeing how I show up, how I show up with challenges of understanding what is compassion, challenges of holding myself in shame, and so much more. Like it's a very deep level understanding where I get very viscerally in touch with my fears, my belonging. This is where I am today with respect to this whole process.
Okay. Just a few more statements about why it's important before we ask you to do some work and things like that. See, this decolonization is not a simple thing. It's a very deeply commercial project. Okay. I don't know how many of you remember about 12, 15 years back or something like that. I'm not sure when it was. 3 Indian women became Miss Universe, Miss World, Miss something else. And if you go back, the amount of lactification creams, that is, whitening creams, the sales went up exponentially after that event. Yeah, so the world recognizing the beauty of Indian women was not a casual, innocent thing. Yeah, it had a huge commercial idea behind it. And the price that is paid by people whose skin is dark and who put on this lactification cream and end up with skin problems is huge, which again helps the GDP, because you go to a doctor and get some medicines and so on. Yeah, but even more than that, the impact on the self-worth of an Indian through this entire lactification process is very high. Yeah. Now, this is just a small thing, and every bit of it, if you look at, will have this underlying commercial and political agenda. Now, any of you wants to feel really bad about yourselves and colonization, please read one book called The Nutmeg's Curse. Okay, written by Amitabh Ghosh. At least the first chapter. Yeah, if you're in for some, feeling bad and despair and depression, read the whole book. Yeah, it talks about the violent political commercial idea behind colonization, right? And after you read the book, spend some time on a mind thought experiment, which is complete fantasy. What if that idiot who went about, just completely savaging the people in this island in the middle of or the edge of the Pacific, if he had engaged in honest trade, if the great East India Company had decided to engage in honest trade, how different the world would be. Yeah, so that is one thing to do. The other thing to do is I'm going to give you books to read, which you may not read, but they're all recipes for depression. There's another book called The End of Empire. Now, this book was written by a BBC guy, right? He talks about what happened when Britain decided to pull out from their huge colonies and things like that. How Eden, how Congo, many of these places, what had happened. You'll be not so surprised or surprised to know that India was the least affected by their machinations. And everywhere, there's a Nehru-like figure, there's a Gandhi-like figure, there are other people who are more ethnic. The same game is played over and over again. The place is left behind in a mess and left behind in a way that resources will always be available to the British. And the people who are running those places will be puppet regimes. Okay, and he also records how, as the British pulled back from their colonies, the building that was supposed to be the imperial center of this colonized thing grew in size. So it's a very interesting, ironic quip on the side. So it's important for us to read all this for two reasons. One, India is in a mess. There's no two ways of looking at it. But if you have to deal with that mess honestly, you have to have a sense of pride or at least a sense of inner balance. We cannot look at ourselves thinking we're a pile of shit and do anything about transforming the nation or ourselves. That's one. Second, most Indians don't like to own up to the fact that we are a defeated nation trying to rediscover our place in the world. Yeah. The third critical thing is, if you look at the colonization of the world, right? You read a book by somebody like Tuhi Weiss Smith or somebody else in America, Native Americans from America and things like that. The differences and the similarities are stark. So for a person who's a Maori, they are struggling with a settler colonized context and they are completely colonized. For them to reach back to their own links, to their own continuities is very difficult. So they suffer from almost a complete annihilation of their continuity, their tradition, and they're struggling to find a way. I'm sure many of you know about how their children were taken away, put in schools, Now that kind of horrific trauma hasn't happened to Indians. But when I was in school, I, was walking, like we had a big guy, a guy called Father Malam, some 6 feet 3 inches. By the way, I was put in this Don Bosco because my parents thought there's no other way for my future. Yeah. So I'm taking off the half day one day. He's standing there. He always stood there at the gate because he thought all the kids in school were going to rush away the moment they had a chance. Maybe he was right because they knew how oppressive they were. So he catches me walking in the other direction and says, "Where do you think you're going, young man?" No? And I say, "I'm going home because I have to, there's a celebration. Celebration to what? To Hanuman." So, "Oh, you're going to pray to your monkey gods, is it?" So I tell him, "You're nobody to say that to me, Father." And I push up. Next morning, I'm taken to his room and whipped. Okay, so I may not have been in one of these schools for years, but I can imagine what it would have been like there and to speak your mother tongue. Yeah, so I was just whipped. Okay. Now, if you look at much of India compared to this, yeah, we're not a fully colonized nation. We're a half colonized nation. And then when you start reading about what happened in the US, for example, you find that the mind of an Indian is actually very similar to the poor whites. There are lots of stories about poor whites, how the Jews were considered poor whites, how people from Ireland were considered poor whites. Our story is closer to the poor white. Yeah. So today we are kind of, like this Ajit joke, na? उसको liquid oxygen में लगा दो और ऑक्सीजन उसको मरना नहीं देगा और liquid उसको जीना नहीं देगा. So we are like that. So we have our continuities. We know about the Upanishads and the Vedas and many of these texts, great texts. We know about the tradition that invited the Parsis into our land. We remember all these stories. We also remember the stupidity of Prithviraj Chauhan, who would stand on his great Dharmic principle and keep excusing the invader who came, who got just one chance and finished them all. And how his father-in-law was the person who ran over to the other side to make a little bit of money or something like that. Yeah, so we have all these histories with us. We have local histories that talk about how, let's say, Ashoka was a Kala Ashok. So I don't know how many of you have gone to that area and talked to local people. Local people don't remember the story of Ashoka because he's called Kala Ashok. Because the story is there is of a violent king. And yet there is a colonial reason why Ashoka is thrown up as the greatest king who ever lived in India. And he was such a peaceful guy that he conquered most of it. Yeah, his empire looks huge, but he's an extremely peaceful guy. And we are told a lie that suddenly in the middle of the Kalinga war, he woke up and became a Buddhist. And then when you read proper history, you find that 6-7 years before that, he had become a Buddhist for completely political reasons and burnt a monastery of 100 Jains who lived around because the previous king or his brother was supporting the Jains. Yeah, so we have all of these stories and we need to make sense of these stories. Right? And how do we try to make sense of these stories? By reading about ourselves in books written by white men and Orientalists. I don't know how many of you have read Dharampal's essential works. If you haven't, and you want to get out of the depression that I have offered you through the other books, please read his book. Yeah? So we really need to do many things. Na? We need to, for example, understand the meaning of the word dharma. Now, most people look at the word dharma and they'll give it some all kinds of heavy meanings and law and all this kind of stuff. It means something extremely simple. It simply means, how do I enliven myself? How do I enliven my immediate context? How do I enliven the world I'm living in simultaneously? Okay, this is the meaning given in the Mahabharata and repeated many times. And there are nice Sanskrit derivations that talk about this word in very beautiful ways. So how do we reinstate that which is fallen? How do we support and regenerate that which is falling? And how do we replenish that which is standing? That's one of the root meanings of the word dharma. And yet today, when we use the word dharma, it means religion. Why does it mean religion? Where did this connection come from? Yeah, you take a word like Maya. Okay, everybody, his uncle, his aunt, and his dog will translate it as illusion. And yet, if you go into that root meaning of the word Maya, Ma means to measure, Ya means that which is disappearing. It's a beautiful one-word description of phenomenon. Because all phenomenon are real, they are measurable, but even before you've started the measurement, they have changed. So what you're trying to measure is decayed, it's gone. So the right translation should be phenomenon and not illusion. So what happens when you take in a word like Maya to mean illusion. You're told, you know what, you guys always had this fantasy about this, that, and the other. Yeah, you always thought that this world was of no use, the other world, whatever, all this very fancy stuff you're given. And you don't ask the question, you know, Shankaracharya, if he had used the word Maya and this is what he meant, was he an idiot to sing songs like Bhaja Govindam? Was he an idiot to set up so many places where his tradition would be continued? He must be nuts, no? If the world is illusory, right? If everything around is illusion, why did he set up these mutts in so many places? Yeah. So we really need to sit back and question the way we think. Where are our categories of thought coming from? Where are our interpretations coming from? Does it make sense to our heart when we read stuff? Yeah, what is the meaning of this, out of India theory and Aryan invasion theory? Why is there so much a fight about it? Decades after it has been proven without a doubt that there was no Aryan invasion at all. Why is it still in the political and in the discourse field? There are lots of questions to ask, but we can ask them only when we really introspect and find out where we come from. Without that, we wear the wrong lenses. So what we have come up with is to say, can I examine the lens through which I'm looking at myself? Can I cleanse that first? Not an easy job. Okay. So can each of you just take 5-10 minutes and write down for yourself, is this question important for you? If not, what we're saying will be good entertainment. If it is, then we can engage in a dialogue as much as we can over this medium. Yeah. Why is this important for you? What are the experiences that viscerally tell you I really need to understand who I am as an Indian?
Welcome back, everyone. Hope you got enough time to reflect. What we will do next is the breakout groups are ready. There are around 4 people in each breakout group. And we'll take around 15 minutes to do a chai pe charcha. You can go and quickly grab your tea and just share with each other why this question and why this quest is important for you. Yeah? Share with each other. I hope it deepens your commitment, and we'll come back and continue. Anything you would like to add, Raghu?
No, just to have a chat, share with each other what's coming up for you.
Yeah.
And then we will take you into a deep dive.
And Ankit, is it 15 minutes for that?
15
there's a-
minutes totally, yeah.
Window.
For the bio breaks, chai, and
And the
chai
chat.
Recorded.
Hi, Sukhvinder, are you there?
Hi, yeah.
Hi, I think we were both in a breakout room.
Oh no, I asked not to be put in a breakout room.
Oh, okay.
So I think this is the main room.
Welcome back, everyone. Over to you, Steve and Raghu. Shall I share the screen?
Yeah, do that.
Yeah.
Is everyone back, Ankit? There's only 24. Some people have dropped out, it looks like.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, we had 30, I think.
Yeah, the moment we tell them to do some work with themselves, they drop out. Good. Okay, now what we will do now is we will take you through some of our thinking and then we will have the dialogue discussion. Yeah, we'll take about 25-30 minutes for that. Okay. Yes, Ankit. You've started screen sharing.
Is
Right.
my screen visible?
Yeah, it is to me. I'm hoping to everybody.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, can you do a...
Can you put it on full screen, Ankit?
Yeah, please put it on full screen.
Lovely.
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah, I briefly referred to this. See, I'm going to tell you some of the key things that came up through our dialogue for a couple of years, like Ankit was saying. See, the first thing that came through to us is that, when we talk about colonization and all that in India, we keep comparing it to literature from other places. Yeah, one of the reasons is because we have not actually written literature of our own that talks about our experience of what happened to us honestly. So we compare it with settler colonies where the dispossession is very clear, right? We have not been fully dispossessed. So Frantz Fanon has written about it. Yeah, he's written about colonies where the dispossession is complete and places, I mean, he particularly talks about India. Wretched of the Earth, he talks particularly about India and talks about how India never really vented its violence and its feeling of oppression. It just did it little bit. It pretended to be extremely nice and non-violent, and then went and ruled from exactly the same structures, not just the Lutyens' buildings, but all the Lutyen structures of law and so on, which we are still carrying. And what that means to a psyche, right? And that is what this half-baked understanding of freedom and of colonization breeds. Yeah. So you write a constitution where you draw Ramayana pictures all around, but the content of the constitution is completely borrowed from France and England and America and all these places, and you call it the most brilliant constitution, but constitution written for whose civilization? Yeah, and by what mind? Through what categories? Yeah, so all of these things come up when you really start thinking hard about this. So what was it that we came up with? One of the things is a false sense of being free. If my dialogue and my discourse is filled with categories and with words and with concepts which are borrowed from elsewhere, am I free at all? I can shout from the top of the treetops and say that I'm free. Am I really free? Yeah. That's one critical thing. Yeah. The other is, what do we do with the feeling of grief? Have we ever grieved the fact that a lot of our heritage has been traumatized? And because we can't do that, we can't even celebrate our heritage properly. And we get caught with this stupid dichotomy between the tradition and the modern. Now, how many Indians talk about tradition versus modern? Whereas in India, there was never an issue of tradition versus modern. That's a completely European thing where there was a clear division between the religious dark ages and then the so-called scientific revolution, and they haven't recognized how deeply caught even their science discourse is in the earlier forms of, insiders, believers, and non-believers. Like, I don't know how many of you have gone through the Vienna Declaration, the Positivist Declaration, where they clearly talk about believers and non-believers. If you're dealing with something that is measurable, it is science. If it's not measurable, it's not science. And then you have these whole set of humanities which end up with science envy and do all kinds of ridiculous things, like using statistics in areas where statistics are not meaningful at all. Yeah. So can we look at our own ways of looking at tradition and looking at modernity, where the two talk?
Steve, are you there?
Yeah.
I think it's internet on Raghu's end.
Yeah, Raghu's video and voice is frozen. Not voice is frozen, the video is frozen.
Okay. I will call him up. Steve, till then, can you take charge here?
Yeah. So, when Raghu earlier clarified about India being half-baked and gave examples of New Zealand and Australia and so on, you have the settler who's taken over the land and he's there physically in your midst. India, however, has had a history of where the invader himself has been invaded. And there's been a series of, uprisings and changes and so on. So it, in that sense, continues to be half-baked. And if I look at today post-independence, with regards to all the laws, we have the upper house and the lower house, the Rajya Sabha. We have laws that even the law of contract comes from Anson and the British laws. We've got certain kinds of land holding to zamindars and jagidars and so on, which continue to have its legacy. So in many ways, what we have done is, even in corporate life, you have the employment letter, which is really essentially covenanted managers, that's what they used to call at one point of time. So you're almost replicating borrowing without thought. That which was used to govern a particular nation, you've now adopted those systems and processes for us as independent India. So in that sense, perpetuating the legacy and the mindset of colonization. So as much as we think that there was a cutoff, that there was that past, the fact is that our systems, processes continue to perpetuate that kind of colonization even today. Raghu, are you back? Ankit, are you there?
Yes, Steve.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was just bringing attention to this whole thing. One more important author, who's Ashish Nandi, who's written a lot about how we have internalized the enemy. Okay, Frantz Fanon also writes about it and so on. So we have ended up walking in the jackboats that we think we have replaced. Okay, that's some of the things I heard Steve talk about. So we have to look at all of this from a different place. We have to find how to look at this. Yeah. Yeah, can you move the slide, Ankit? Right. So there are lots of things. There's an idea in Indic thought called Yuga Dharma. Yuga Dharma means a larger consensus of ideas that we take for granted and never question. It's like the soup in which we are floating. And we take many of these ideas for granted without questioning where they came from and what is the actual implication of those ideas. Yeah. For example, we take monotheism to be something that is the idea of religion. So the word religion itself comes from this kind of thing. Yeah. And it's not only in religion that monotheism is celebrated. It's celebrated in so many different ways where one thought has to be followed right through. Communism is as monotheistic as any religion. Okay, so I'm not using the word theism only in terms of religion out here. The other is the idea of an individual, which if you think about it is ridiculous. Yeah, I'm not a billiard ball. Everything in me from the time I brush my teeth is interdependent with everything in the world. My language comes because somebody taught me. My use of words are laced with my upbringing. What of me is this indivisible, separate being? Nothing. And yet today we use the word individual as though it's a taken for granted thing. Yeah. The other thing that we are faced with is utilitarianism. Now, the biggest word now is monetizing. I have to be able to monetize everything. And if I'm not able to monetize it, something is wrong with me and my thinking. And rationalism. Okay, now anybody who studied the brain and the mind knows that the known world is about 10% of all reality. Even in our own, if you take words that actually denote something that is measurable, that is clear, that is tangible, is about 10 to 15% of any vocabulary. The rest of vocabulary is about life, which is in the connotative world, which has got to do with feelings, which has got to do with relationships. And yet we celebrate rationality, which is limited logic applied in a certain specific linear cause-effect way. And physics is telling you that this cause-effect way of looking at the world is not sustainable. And we are just hanging on to these. So much of the debate, much of the discourse is happening with taking ideas for granted, which need to be questioned. And all of these ideas are coming from a Europeanization of the world. Yeah. So what does it lead to? Na? It leads to many things which are ultimately leading to the climate crisis. The new is always greater and better than the old. Yeah, maybe the best way of living is to go and learn from the Hopis. They know how to live with the world. They've known how to deal with rivers and, do engineering with rivers. Maybe we need to go back and learn from them. Yeah, measurement is valid. So GDP becomes God. Elections are won and lost on the idea of GDP. And GDP is one of the worst measures possible. Right? Ideas like what is success? Right? And worst of all, the amount of money that is being made through fear of death. Yeah, most polytheistic cultures don't fear death. The moment you create fear of death, you can make money hand over fist. Yeah. So it's really sad that we're buying into a whole discourse, a whole way of thinking about ourselves, which is actually leading to a crisis. And all this is part of, maybe I'm biased, all this is part of internalizing colonized ways of thinking. Yeah. Yes, Ankit. Right? So many of the, many of this is not particular to Indic thought, but Indic thought has worked a lot on this. One is an idea of many truths, right? The second is that the self itself is an emergent reality. It's not a permanent entity. I, as I am today, right now, is born out of this interaction. When I'm going to say hello to my wife after this, that's not the same Raghu as the one who's speaking here. Yeah. spirituality, which is based on ecology. Almost every polytheistic thought in the world looks at the earth as the mother, right? There's one Native American person who's written I think a book about it, but I just read a paper where he says that there is a difference. There are two sets of people in the world. One who believe that they belong to the earth, and the other set of people who believe that the earth belongs to them. Yeah. And here I wouldn't mind an either or thought about this. Okay. And Indic wisdom believes that truth comes out of meditative insight. It doesn't come out of measurement. Right. So if we can really look at many of these things, no, we might look at the world and ourselves very differently, which is closer to something that leads to a sustainable universe. Yeah. One is, can you value the immeasurable? Can you look at countries like Bhutan and look at what happiness index means? Yeah. Can we look at ideas of transcendence instead of getting caught with fear of death? How do we deal with inevitables of life, like growing old, instead of investing in ways where you don't show up that you're old? Now, every gray hair is a problem. I saw one very interesting 5-minute cartoon clip video about what happens to this person who looks into the mirror and there's one white hair coming out and the kind of panic it creates. Beautifully done video. Yeah. Growing up and everything. But the problem is when you accept most of these things, your current scaffolding that holds up the economy and political reality is going to get shaken up. Yeah, can you move it? Right. So this is how we looked at the framework. Huh? Yeah. Click. Right. We said there are two ends. We're looking at two polarities. Now, polarity is different from normal 2x2. A polarity means both ends of the pole are alive. You can't get rid of one or the other. It's like North Pole and South Pole. If you cut the magnet, you'll again get another North Pole and South Pole. And one of the things I find very funny is people are talking about, the most popular word today is polarization, whereas polarization means an equity and a dialogue between two ends. What is actually being talked about is exclusivization. And the word that is used is polarization. So the word polarity itself is being screwed up. Yeah. So there's one part of me, and I think for all of us here, where there is a rage of the colonized mind. So if I look at temples that have been broken up and this thing, there is a rage inside. Yeah. There is also a part of me that would like to own up the trauma in a way that there is healing. Yeah. And then this is a difficult thing to look at, no? That all of us, because we're half colonized, and most of us are Macaulay's children, we can't run away from that, right? Where are we in the way we colonize others and how we try to colonize the world, right? So there is, in me, there's a will to dominate and say, let's come on, man. If India wins, if India beats England in cricket, I'm so happy. If India loses to England in cricket, I feel a little depressed for the next couple of days. I can lose to Pakistan quite happily. But losing to England, the bloody limeys, is terrible, yeah? There is also a will to integrate, no? All the college life, I was singing Dylan songs. Yeah. So this is one polarity for us to examine. Yeah. And then the other very important polarity is where am I located when I'm looking at this whole thing? Am I located in a shame of belonging, or am I located in a pride of belonging? Right? We're coming from an idea that unless I anchor myself in some kind of pride of belonging, I cannot look at the reality of my people or my reality or my world from a place where we can make changes which are positive. If I'm continuing to look at it with self-hate, like a lot of Indians do, there is no way we're going to make any change which leads to a dharmic possibility. We cannot do something that leads to flourishing of us and other people. It is going to be destructive of us and of other people. Yeah. So then we ended up with, if you put this together, you get 4 quadrants. Now, why is it important to look at it like this? No, we told you that we took 15, 20 of us about a couple of years of dialogue to come up with something like this. What we found was when any of us start by talking from a certain place inside of me. Yeah, supposing I start talking about my hurt and my trauma at being colonized. Somebody or the other from the group will come and talk about something else. Yes, 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 no, 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 but all this kind of a thing. And then they will either talk about, you know what, we need to do this. Or they will say, yeah, it's nice, but why are you bringing it up? 70 years have gone. Why don't we forget about this? Something or the other. So no inquiry into the reality of that particular part of my mind was possible without identifying where I'm coming from. Right? So when we look at these as different locations from which I'm speaking, and then be able to see the writing that we have all over the place and see where is that writer coming from, then inquiring into each of these mindsets becomes very, very easy and possible. And we know where we're running away, why we're running away from each of these. Yeah, like for example, this black face, white mask area. Okay. The whole of Lutyens, India is a black face, white mask. Okay. And if you read so much of our literature and things like that, it's the struggle of this black face, white mask when there are when it's a serious writing. Otherwise, it's justifying the white mask and making it even more white. Yeah, the entire lactification process, all of that is stuck here. So can we look at it honestly? Where are we drawing it into ourselves? Where have we drawn the imposition from our past and things like that, right? And then there's a whole lot of our reaction that comes from what we're calling the righteous retaliator. We'd love to say that anything that happened at any time started in India. Yeah, I have the ridiculous experience of having been sitting with this person, Ganapati Stapati, who's a great architect, who's a traditional person, right? Now, the Nataraja has sound on one hand and light on the other. And he's playing the damru and all that. It's a beautiful sculpture. It's a sculpture about time, and there's a lot of symbolism about it. He would like to equate it to E is equal to MC squared. Yeah. So I'm sitting there and saying, give me a break, man. E is equal to MC squared is from a completely different world. No, if you tell him that, you know what, Nataraja is not the origin of E is equal to MC squared, you don't know. He might take the Nataraja next to him and bang your head with it. Because he's so convinced that the idea of space and time came from India. Right? We can't see that this might be in a different space, that's in a different space, nothing. Yeah, so much of stuff that we see today happening are all these righteous retaliators anchorage. But if we don't own it up We don't see for ourselves where we can legitimately feel proud, where we're getting arrogant, where we're getting more than arrogant. So we need to understand this space, right? And then the other space that we found is this, there's many of us belong to this. We're all colorless, odorless, rootless, whatever. We feel very proud that we don't know our mother tongue. We will go, like I did at one point of time, though I'm very sure I did it much, much more honestly than most people I know, and so on and so forth. Go to the grassroots in order to tell those people how stupid they are being Indian and how they ought to be something else. Okay, the biggest shock I got, I remember, was sitting with a group of people on healing or something. I remember many years back with Amukta. I don't know where she is now. Yeah, you're sitting with a group of people there, village women and men, and we're supposed to teach them something, and I'm having a slight cold. And this old lady says, "Oh, you've got a cold." She just walks out to the room, picks up 2 herbs, comes and gives it to me. And I eat it, and then she prepares a kashayam. I'm fine by the afternoon. And I'm going to teach her about health. Yeah. And I pretend that I don't have any color, I don't have any odor. Yeah, I use underarm deodorant every morning, see? The space inside ourselves which has some wisdom and sagacity and heals all of these things, we can't go forward. So what does it mean and so on is something that we need to explore. Yeah. So the labs that we do and the deeper exploration we do, we go into each of these in detail and depth to discover where we are. And without owning up to myself where I'm coming from, I cannot have a dialogue. I can only have a cacophony. I can only have a vivada. Fight with somebody because they're coming from a different point of view. Maybe it's important to listen to that point of view and understand and respect that point of view and find out why is this person entrenched in that point of view. Yeah, why is somebody shouting so hard, saying, "I'm Indian, please look at me and how great I was in my life last 1,000 years. Anything that happens today happened 7,000 years ago." Can I understand the trauma of this person? Otherwise, I'm just going to say me versus him and things like that. And, how does that help? Yeah. Can we go to the next slide? Right. Now, one of the things that we found very difficult for all of us to own up is how we have internalized the oppressor in many ways and how we are part of the oppression. Okay. How am I a brown sahib? Right. I remember in college, there were a group of us who would sing Simon and Garfunkel and Dylan and all that. Anybody who wore a dhoti was called a lungi. Okay, obviously derogatory word. Imagine a Brahmin fellow wearing a white veshti being called a lungi guy. So what happened was that I ended up in one of these Carnatic music shows because I love this Carnatic music show, and I was wearing a dhoti and a kurta, and I was sitting there, and one of my so-called lungi friends was standing there and he's saying, "Hey, what are you doing here, man?" Yeah. So can I own up to both? Can I own up to how I become a brown sahib, how I retain my tradition? How do these two dialogue with each other? Yeah. How am I today looting and plundering by saying I own up to my Indian heritage? Yeah. I'm suddenly finding a lot of people jumping on the bandwagon today who were a couple of years back very strongly leftist. Suddenly they're quoting the Upanishads. I don't know why. They suddenly rediscovered something and right. And going out into the world and talking about the greatness of Indian thought, so on and so forth, and claiming to be the new gurus or some such thing. Yeah. And then there is this whole dialogue now of guilt of privilege. Right? If I own something more than somebody else, I must, go down and feel guilty about it and make up for this and all of this kind of stuff that's happening. Yeah, a lot of young people I see are getting pulled into this. Not being able to own up to their heritage properly, not able to look at it. If they start looking at it, they have to feel guilty and so on. Yeah, I think a lot of wokeism would fall into this guilt of privilege area. Right? And then how do I look at all of this and see the energy here and understand what does it mean to re-establish a dharmic way of living? Yeah. So this is the framework we came up with, and it's helped us a lot in exploring ourselves, having dialogues, being able to be with somebody who is exploring this part of themselves. Yeah, and not calling them out as, something wrong with you, or this or that. Right? How do I stay with the person who is experiencing a guilt of privilege and help them explore that fully and not run away from it? Yeah. How do I help a Brahm Sahib sit with this person and help them understand where they are? Maybe there's some things from that position that are important for me to internalize and understand and integrate into myself and so on. Yeah, so we're finding these 8 positions, points of view or locations within ourselves very, very useful to understand ourselves fundamentally. Because most of the time what we're doing is we're running away from understanding ourselves. We don't want to look at how much of a brown sahib most of us are. We don't want to look at how we own up to our own heritage and so on. And how do we honor each of these? And if each of these parts of ourselves are held without integration, how do we discover a place from which we can find some form of harmony and integration between these so that we can act in ways that are meaningful in the world today? Yeah. And the other thing that struck us when we were working with this is, I don't think this is a framework that only Indians have to be looking at. I think this is a framework everybody in the world ought to be looking at so that we can discover how to dialogue. Yeah. So that's the story of the frameworks that we have come up with. Steve, you want to add?
No, Raghu, I think we also passed the time. So if there are any reflections that few folks may have, that's the time to do it now. I just wanted to share that there will be a face-to-face manthan, that's what we call these labs, sometime in October, November. So if any of you are keen to join, then let Ankit know. We do have limited seats for that. So it'd be good to get some early indication of your interest. Yeah, so questions, reflections.
Not really questions, reflection. Number one, I would like to, know the timings and the location of this manthan that you mentioned, Steve. I mean, only then could I decide whether I could. Of course, I'm interested. And if I have to hear Professor Raghu, I can just go on and on. And therefore, my one request to him is, you spoke about, I mean, this was a revelation.
One request, Mitraji, is keep quiet. Don't keep talking too much.
Okay. Now, I wanted a query,
I thought that's what you're telling me.
I didn't get you.
When you started and you said, I can keep on listening to this guy, I thought you were going to say, I wish he would keep quiet.
Oh, no. I wish it could go on. So I wanted to ask you to repeat what you said, because that was so different from what I knew till now. Your interpretation of Maya that you said, that Maya is not an illusion. I could not note it down. Could you just repeat if possible?
We
or
will,
maybe
Mr. Father, we will send you the link to the recording.
We'll send you the link to the recording.
And you can go through it again.
Yeah.
Any other, and on the first part, when the brochure gets ready, we'll send the brochure also out to all of you, which will give you more details about the program. Yeah.
Yeah. Raghu, this is Pankaj. First,
Yes, Pankaj.
Very, very, very.
When you come on screen, yeah.
Okay, your screen is off. Sorry, I turned it on. I think. Okay. So Raghu, firstly, thank you so much. It's good to see you always. You help me in my ERI. So in IMA. Okay. So going back to this particular thing, as you rightly mentioned, your state of mind is a philosophy which keeps on changing every moment. So in that case, when we talk about these three different mindsets, whether it's guilt of privilege or dharmic warrior, is it also something which is fixed or it keeps on changing as per the moment of time?
I think it is changing, Pankaj, which is why I'm saying, like for example, right now this UCC is in your face.
Correct.
Right? And when we four of us were in the breakout room, inevitably we kind of referred to that. Now, when I'm speaking about it, can I be clear where I'm coming from? Yeah, not necessarily right or wrong or any such thing. If I know where I'm coming from, then I can be much more reflective about my own points of view and hold my conclusions lightly.
Sure.
Yeah. If you come from a different point of view, I won't fight with you.
Yeah.
If you're open to dialogue, I could dialogue with you and ask you where you're coming from. And so on. But if I'm unconscious, if I don't understand where I'm coming from, and somebody I'm talking to has a different point of view. Yeah. Now, in subjects like this, which are important for India on the whole and so on, you'll only respond from a visceral feeling level, which you don't own up to.
Yeah.
And get into a fight. Yeah. And either or is not the Indian way. So if I really have to anchor in the Indian way, I have to discover dialogue.
Sure.
None of our texts are either or. They're all dialogue based. So if I have to really discover a civilizational way of engaging with myself today, how do I understand dialogue? Without deep introspection, can I really enter dialogue?
Sure.
Yeah, so that's where we are coming from.
And I guess, Pankaj, that we're also saying that we are this lens and that lens and that lens and more.
Correct. So it's a
And
assimilation of everything always all the time.
and
It's
what
not
Raghu
either
is
or.
saying is, yeah. And are you aware of the feet on the ground you stand on, and from where you make a reflection? What is the
Yeah.
ground on which you make it from? That awareness itself is the first movement. Okay. Siddharth, you go first, next, and then Shashank.
Sure.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you, Raghu sir. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve. Namaste, Raghuji. I would want to understand a little bit of difference between the Brown Sahib and the looter and the plunderer, because in my head, both are almost in the same thing, but like, how do they both differ?
The Brown Sahib sits in Lutein buildings and loots us. Yeah. The looters and the plunderers today are people who are standing on another indic stuff and looting and plundering.
The former anchored
It's
with shame, the latter with pride.
with pride. Okay. And or insane pride or whatever, right? If you were using your new understanding of Indian in a way that is meaningful, you'd be using it in dharmic ways, right? Yeah, I don't want to name names and then get into some, somebody will slap a suit on me. Yeah, so let's not get there. But just think back. Yeah, on so many things. Like, I'm seeing, architects today who will copy a plan from Better Homes and Gardens or whatever that is. Take Indian motifs and put it on the door and put it on the walls and call it an Indian design. I call this looting and plundering, as though you're Indian. Yeah. And I also hear people who will tell you that, the temple is all full of shit, it's a depressing place, it is this, it is that, without having gone to a temple and really prayed there and discovered what it means to go and experience the power of a temple. Yeah. So this is the difference between a Brown Sahib location and the other location. Right? Both are equally adharmic, equally divisive, equally self-serving.
Okay.
Correct. Thank you.
Shashank?
Yeah.
Hello, Raghu. Hello, Steve. Hello, Ankit. So for me, actually, the first question was related to shame and pride. So you named it as a polarity, and several of the locations really spoke to me in the quadrants that were shared. But at the same time, because it was also polarity, then what you said about polarity, that both exist uh, in a way, like it's not exclusive one or the other, it's sort of both exist. So I'm wondering, how does one, could you talk a little more about how do we engage with the pride and the shame without getting lopsided, either towards pride, which is the plunder, and or towards the shame, which is the Brown Sahib?
First thing, Shashank, I don't think we're saying don't get lopsided. We're saying that both locations are possible. Right. Now, I'm just fresh from 3 days of listening to Rudram, Ghana Rudram. Okay, very rare, fantastic. Okay, it's mathematical precision, it's very powerful. So I'm sitting there, I'm listening to this. Right, I can't but be filled with the pride of this tradition, which could figure out the power of sound, which could figure out the power of mathematics, and all of that in this particular thing. And there are this 11 chaps, reciting Ganarudram from the mind. No books, nothing. Yeah. And then I'm listening to somebody else talk on the side. Okay. Which I mean, which is very, very prejudiced discussion about this is who we are and we should go back to our pride. I feel ashamed being in this context. Yeah. What do? I have to own up to both. Na? It's happening in the same room at the same time. One part of me feels proud of the heritage. Yeah. Another part of me is feeling ashamed of my belonging. Can I be clear and own up to both? So when I'm speaking to this person, I don't disown the fact that, you know what, I just don't like the way you're speaking. Yeah. How do I put it across to this person without holding that person in contempt? Because maybe 10 minutes later, that person is going to move over to a place where they are experiencing something about us with pride. So if I don't own up my location, how can I enter into a dialogue? And then we'll end up with positions which maybe we're going to change 10 minutes later. Yeah. So that's very important. Now, otherwise you box people, you get into either or positions, and which is not true in life.
Yeah.
So a learned teacher that Raghu and I both know of, Pulin, would say that really this work is about making that which is not visible visible. Yeah. That which is disowned for it to be owned. That which is not acted on to be allowed to be acted. And to really make the inarticulate articulate. And that's what really happens in the manthan, is to give awareness to all sides that come up, which are held with either shame, pride, rage, or a desire for owning up.
See, the other thing that happens, Shashank, is there is some kind of an idiotic idea that if I'm feeling rage of a trauma, that I can actually come and speak from a sensible place without having a space in which I can express my rage and be heard. Yeah. So the moment I express either my rage or my shame or my guilt, everybody else is so scared of receiving that feeling that they shut it up. Yeah, which is why none of these positions can be explored, and there are positives and negatives in both. Right? I'm sitting here today. How can I disown the fact that I love, reading Plato, or I love reading somebody as much as I love reading Upanishads? Yeah. And how do I know how much of my thinking is influenced by this or by that? How do I separate out these things? But I also hold the rage, man, about so many things around me. Right? If I speak from there, there's nobody to listen to. They'll just run away. I can also speak with pride. So what if it's insane pride? Give me a chance. No, let me just state it, and then I might be able to sit back and look at it and explore it and say, hey, man, maybe this doesn't have real ground. But if all of that is stuck and congealed in a strange kind of unacceptance of me as a human being and an Indian, how does it work? Yeah. And unless I clear it up, how do I discover my humanness?
Okay.
Thank you so much. I have one more question. Can I ask?
After Puneet.
After Puneet.
You put up your hand again, you'll be back in the queue.
Yeah, hi. I hope you guys can hear me. And Shashank, if it's a connected question, then I won't mind you going first.
It's a separate question. So.
Sure, great. So, Raghu, thank you so much, and Steve for holding this. It's fantastic. It's the very first time I'm engaging in such a discussion or conversation and dialogue. So I'm completely illiterate. I would treat myself as, just about beginning to discover what needs to be discovered. And I believe I'll remain in this mode for some time till I'm beginning to learn the very fundamentals and building blocks of understanding of dharma, dharmic way of decision making and being. So how does one cope with this phase of illiteracy and where you don't have concepts in your mind, within yourself to work with? You just have a hunger and an instinct and some sense that yes, an answer lies on the other side, but absolutely no framework or definitions to work with. How does one go along and not get lost?
Steve can answer this question.
Yeah. I think that the entire Manthan is about embodied work. And the whole process of experiencing is not through the cognitive lens, but is to really be in touch with your body and how the body is feeling and responding to. This is not work that lends itself and gets informed by frames or by books. There are perspectives. But the inner perspective that comes from an awareness, that comes from being deeply aware of what the body is telling you at that moment as you're going through some of the enactment, because we use several forms of engaging with the self in the spaces that get enabled. That itself, to my mind, is a good start. Commitment, a deep desire to interrogate what really is happening in the here and now. Raghu, you want to add to that?
Yeah. See, a couple of things, Puneet. One is what you've said is important. To wake up and say, hey, I really got to discover this. That's very, very critical. The second is not to get carried away because I'm speaking about it so much as though I know a hell of a lot. I'm also searching and finding and whatever. Yeah. Luckily, many of you are willing to think that I know a little bit. So you're sitting here and listening to me. Good for me. Yeah. The other critical thing is to really commit to a search. Okay. Pankaj knows some of our, teachers that Steve and I share, like Pulin and all that. Yeah. So you have to search, man. You listen to a lot of people, and if anybody ranted, Pulin did. If anybody spoke from wisdom, Pulin did, and so on, right? You have to listen to many points of view and discover your own. Yeah. The one thing that I would suggest is don't read things about India from people who have not experienced India. Okay, which means don't read Discovery of India. Yeah, it's written by a person who knew nothing about the country. Right? Read Aurobindo. Yeah, read Vivekananda. Read Dalit literature. There's a lot of fantastic poems. Yeah, and there are people who are Dalit Bhaktas. So it's not as though, there is this whole woke thing, that India always kept everybody down and this, that, and the other. That's not true. If it was true, how come you have so many fantastic poets and all that who are accepted all over the place? So there's a whole range of Indic literature that needs to be explored. Go and read in your mother tongue. Yeah, what's your mother tongue?
Hindi.
Pardon?
Hindi.
Hindi. Good. Lots of literature, man, which is written by Indians, no, at heart. Yeah. So all that helps a lot because many of the words, when they're translated into English, completely lose the meaning. Right? And then you internalize that. A lot of literature, by the way, which historians use, I don't know why they use it, about India, were written by people who were paid by the British East India Company to write shit about India so that they could justify the loot in Britain. This is known. And yet
Some never visited India.
And one of these big guys who still quoted never visited India, including Marx. He never visited India, and he has opinions about India. And there are people who carry these opinions and tell us all about who Indians are. So you got to watch out for that kind of stuff. Yeah. And whatever, Vivekananda is a good option. Yeah.
But Raghu, you made a very strong comment on discovery of India, Jawaharlal Nehru.
Have you read the book? Have you read it?
No, I'm not.
Please
Only
don't.
TV. Okay.
No, please don't read it.
Bharat Coach TV serial.
No, yeah, there were two things that came up, no, at the same time. Bharat Ki Chap and Bharat Ek Coach.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bharat Ki Chap was done by leftist. I know them. I know the people who did that film from NID. Right? They refused to talk to Dharampal and his group when they came to Chennai because they didn't want anything except a leftist point of view. Okay. The Bharat Ek Coach, at least some parts of it is well filmed and things like that, but it follows the line of thought which is not authentically Indian.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
We
So
need to keep an eye on the time.
The reality of it. Yeah.
Okay. We are running out of time. The last person to come in now is Shashank, right? It was you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Shashank. And we close with
so
your
my
question
relates to the earlier slide that you shared where the self was also like a relational emergent self which emerges in different contexts and it can be different. And similarly, the other was related to measurement and on one side and meditative insight of truth on the other. So I always struggle with this, that any kind of power, in this case, say the state power that I'm wanting to ask a question about, is at least in my experience or in my little understanding, is a lot based on identity and belonging, which assumes sort of a staticness about self, assumes a staticness about truth. So I'm wondering, how does the relational emergence of self and meditative insight into truth connect to power and in the way power can be exercised? Because otherwise everything, like the power today is of course about domination and extraction, but it seems to work when there is a staticness of identity that, hey, I'm a Dalit or I'm a Hindu or I'm whatever. And similarly belongingness also.
That is one form of power, Shashank. And if I use Sanskrit, it is Balam. It is not Shakti. Shakti comes from owning up to your Kriya Shakti, Ichcha Shakti, Jnana Shakti. Whereas these are Balams. Yeah, Asana Balam, which means what seat am I sitting on? Right? So I'm sitting on the seat of Dalit leadership, so I'll hold a certain point of view. Just give the Balam. Yoga Balam. Who do I say are my people, not my people? Kala Balam. Today it's fashionable, it's useful to shout from one of these megaphones. Yeah, so power itself has to be understood differentially. And where do you come from? Right? So there's another power that comes when you refuse to get boxed into any of this. And that's a power which is very difficult to own up to and act from, because it's a power of freedom, and you have to rely completely on yourself, your own resources, and your own willingness to stand up for what you think is truth. Yeah. The best example I know of that is Vinoba Bhave. Okay.
Also, I think that there's a book called The Lies That Bind by a guy called Appiah. And, in the end, whenever people ask you the question, where are you from, is really a deeper question of what are you? Because all these classifications of ethnic, class, color, creed are all actually to pin down the larger question of what are you? And the what are you is sociological, psychological, ecological, and individualistic. But they are essentially used as weapons for division, not for integration. The deeper search must lie in abandoning classification and isms and search for the truth within. So it's the personal identity of the self rather than the identity of social frames. Okay, Raghu, we are
Just
at least 30.
Yeah, just one small thing. See, identity as a fixed thing is Western idea. Yeah.
Say more, Raghu, say more on this.
He just
Very, very simple, yeah.
You can't leave it like that.
Very simple. You talked about Kala Patra Sandarbha and all that, no? So who I am depends on Kala Patra Sandarbha. For example, what context am I awakening myself in? And just to give you a quick idea of this, if you take the Mahabharata, and I have to fall back on Mahabharata whenever I get a chance, right? Nobody has a single name, right? So Arjuna is Arjuna in one point of time. He is Sabyasachi at another point of time. Another point of time, he is Kunti Putra. Another point of time, he is somebody else. Because in those contexts, that is the part of him that comes alive. Kunti Putra cannot come alive in the middle of the fight. If Kunti Putra comes in the middle of the fight, he had it, man. Yeah. So Bhima cannot be Kunti Putra at that point. He has to be Vrikodara, no? He has to be that violent guy, with this abdomen. Yeah, abdomen looking like a wolf. Right. So they're all relational, yeah. Right. The person who will come alive, Sashank, when your grandmother calls you is different from the person who will come alive when your wife or I say, hi, Sashank. It's a different person, no? That really is the emergent self. But I hold on to a constructed idea of myself. Right? So in Sanskrit, that's called asmita. And in the yogic thing, there are many levels of this. Whereas in Western language itself, mind is just one thing. Whereas here, mind means several things, and so on. So the frames of reference, the languaging, the concepts that go with it are all very, very different. And my understanding is this is true of most original, polytheistic people. Same person can have many names. There's an anthropological study I read recently where, in this place, people will be called different things depending on the last thing you did that was memorable. Yeah. Reminds me of college, no? I mean, imagine, Sashank, you go and tell somebody, have you met Raghu? They'll say, who the hell are you talking about? No? So right? So there's so many people in college who I don't know their names, their actual names. I might know their roll number and I might know their other names that we call them with fondly. So apparently this is a tradition in some societies.
Right. All good things must come to an end, Raghu. Are we all okay to stop here?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ankit, what are the next steps in terms of post the call? You'll send the link.
12:30 today, Steve.
Oh, is it? Oh, then I'm
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, my bad.
So we have time to listen to some reflections and so on.
Oh, fabulous. Fabulous.
Yeah,
okay, thanks for correcting me. Yeah. And I also would like to hear from Kirtana.
I'm logging on. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So, Kirtana, you had attended one of these manthans. Would you like to share something from there? You don't have to, if you wish.
Give me 1 second.
Sure.
Yeah, hi, sorry. Anything in particular or my experience in general?
Anything that you'd like to share, Kirtana.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there was a point where I think to one of the questions, the answer, Steve, you jumped in to say it was a very embodied practice, right? So I think for me, a lot of it over the 4.5 days, it just kept getting deeper and deeper at a very experiential level. So, and that actually was one of the reasons why I joined Yoga Sadhana Gauri. I see you. And I started yoga teacher training program as well for that reason. It's because I started to really get in touch with myself physiologically and all the changes I started to experience in my body. So, and I'm in touch with a lot of it at a very somatic or experiential level now, as opposed to just at a mind level. So that's what the manthan did. And it gets deeper, it gets richer. So yeah, any specific question I'm happy to answer. But I think right now I'm at a very, like for me, I think the big shift that happened was really coming into my body at the manthan for me personally.
Thank you. Thank you.
How has it impacted your viewing of law? Seriously.
I mean, to be fair, I was always jaded about the law. I was, in the sense that
unjade yourself, Kirtana. It's a very important area to work with, yeah.
No,
that's where the
what I mean,
biggest colonization happened.
Exactly. No, what I mean is, what I mean by jaded by law is I mean jaded by what I see of the law around me, right, and how it is applied. And in fact, law and justice is one of the systems that has been so deeply colonized that, in fact, in some court systems, like in some courts, in like district courts, etc., some people literally get down on their knees when a judge walks by and things like that, right? Like they literally like bow down on their haunches, right? That's what it's called. So it's really deeply colonized, and you say "my lord" still, and that was something I could never get used to when I did some litigation, like as a student here and there. And you see it. I can break it down in the way I understand it, which is, you see it in the way the court is structured, like administratively, or like the way it's structured and it functions. You can see it in the way justice is understood, like criminal justice, right? Like you're constantly othering the accused, right? And that ends up creating so much more damage and harm to the society than what we were left with. And one of the reasons why I'm also jaded is because I did a lot of criminal justice research work, and I was part of a research project where we interviewed prisoners on death row, their families, and lawyers. So we really like saw the worst impact of criminal justice system, right? And I really see it failing on a regular basis. So, how do we really understand justice in context to crime and in context to healing and accountability? So that was the other thing that came up for me. The third, I think, is this idea of like and, right? So, like to design a system where there are multiple possibilities and multiple pathways, like it's structured differently. So there is no one answer to everything, right? Like, so you understand the context and then you respond to it. So how do we then design law and justice um, in accordance to that context? Are things that I'm left exploring with. So in fact, like one thing that I know, I've talked to a few people and I really like, there's a lot of interest is within like even in restorative justice, understanding it through the Indic lens. There are some people wanting to explore that because everyone's working on restorative justice, but they don't see it through the Indic lens yet, and they feel a little stuck also. I know that much in how they're approaching the work. So yeah, so I think so to answer your question, Raghu, how did it change my understanding of the law? It didn't change my understanding of the law as much as it gave me a lens to view the law through.
That's what I mean.
Right?
That's what it.
Yeah. It gives me like a lens that like then I'm framing my own language and my own articulation, but this framework and this lens and this embodiment is the grounding is being laid in that sense.
Okay.
Anybody else wants to share whatever before we
Maybe
close?
just share how this last few hours has left some of you.
Yeah, I just hope you have more of these instead of being so far apart. So a request that you have these sort of interactive sessions more often, Steve.
Mira, we can only hear every second or third word. The line connection is not very clear.
I can share
Can't
my
do
reflection.
anything about
Yeah,
it.
go ahead, Mira.
No, I'm in a bad area, so go ahead.
Yeah, Mira, you can probably type it on the chat. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to share my reflection. So I think through in these 2 hours, what has been a big revelation is those 4 quadrants. And as Raghu, you were sharing your story, I could see myself in different quadrants, being the brown sahib, or even the looter, or even feeling that deep guilt and privilege, guilt of my own privilege. Yes, being born into a family which had some means, uh, being that I am, it's just being me. It's wrong. Something is wrong, and by living my life as I've got to live, I'm doing unjust. And as so that was a big revelation. And as I see forward, the question which I'm holding with is, how can I don't see that if I will be able to reduce completely being the brown sahib and the looter and the guilt. One, can that reduce entirely to the zero, or can I increase my propensity to be the dharmic warrior more? And what does it mean in my context to maybe play with these energies and find that more within me is what I'm present with?
Yeah. No, just a quick reflection. The more you have an insight into where you're from, the less likely it is for it to compulsively get you and unconsciously get you. So you have choices. And the more you see the reality of me as an emergent phenomenon, the more you can anchor yourself in being human. Yeah, because I cannot wipe out where I'm born from. I cannot wipe out whatever is called privilege or lack of privilege or whatever. The question is, how do I deploy it today? Yeah. So making a person feel guilty for privilege is an idiotic thing to do. The only thing to do is to ask the person, sure, you have this privilege. Can you help me build a dharmic world with your privilege? Yeah, but today that's not what is happening. No? That's the problem.
Thank you. Thank you. That helps. If I may just add, I think if someone else has anything. Okay. In that context, then I am also present to that. How do I deepen this practice or sadhana of being present to my emergent self? That becomes something very elusive sometimes. It's a big work to do. Can be heavy on the shoulders.
Yeah, it is. It is. But is there any other way? If you really committed to being dharmic and creating a world sustainable, regenerative, so on, is there any other way? Can I do it by hanging on to these ways of categorizing myself, other people categorizing me, getting caught with it, and all of that is there? That's not the way at all. No?
Yeah, there are two raised hands. Who would like to go first?
Kirtan, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I just want to add to what Aditya was just saying. Aditya, I think that's like in terms of what I was talking about, experiencing it very intensely at the Manthan was exactly that, like trying to move into that fourth quadrant. I started to feel a lot more in my body, right? And like all the blockages in my chest area, my throat area, my ankles, and like generally all of that. That's why I decided to, like, I've always done yoga, but it's been on and off and like a few things like that. So that's why like I decided to commit to the practice, because then I realized that it was now a matter of like me getting into it and sticking to my practice and committing to it than anything else. So yeah.
I think the couple of takeaways for me, especially which I'm sitting with, are either and or is not the indique, it's the and. I think we're so sort of trained to look at one side and go with that. That's very interesting revelation that I want to sit with. In conjunction with the identity piece, which is we can have multiple identities depending on different pieces. Again, we're so sort of trained or brought up with having one identity or one right identity, if I have to say, that we disregard some of the other aspects of it. So these are two things which I'm sitting with and taking away. So thank you very much for these two revelating concepts today. Thank you.
So that's just a small correction. It's not that we have multiple identities. We can identify with different things in different contexts. And this idea of a single identity comes from the push that the Catholic Church made at one point of time for authenticity. So when you go and sit in purgatory and wait for the other thing, they know who you are to fix you. Yeah. So these are all, these are not realities of, these are not experienced realities at all. For me to be the same, through my life is a completely impossible thing. I will keep changing in different contexts. So can I just take that for granted and not call it multiple identity? The moment you call it multiple identity, there is stuff written about split personality. You'll go off into that, split personality, unsplit personality. That is pathological stuff, which is completely different. Yeah, but this idea of one individual, one identity is a wrong thing completely. There is, I mean, Kirtana will tell you how jurisprudence requires that the fellow who stole is still the same guy whom you punish. Otherwise, how do you punish this guy? It really came from all of these backgrounds. No, how do you fix responsibility for a guy who did something? How do you punish somebody? Yeah, that is why relational stuff is what gets worked out in most other communities. There is no punishment justice. There is restorative justice because of that. Yeah.
So unlike a fixed object, we hold the notion of the being and the becoming. And that as we traverse through the living saga, there are pulls that provoke, as resonances and dissonances in us. Some which we are engaged with, super engaged with, some denied, some withheld. And all of these are constellations that grip us from time to time as we meander across. That process of, working with the being and the multiple forms of becoming is really that invitation to looking at oneself.
Yes, I mean, for example, I'm looking at myself right now, and I'm saying I strongly identify being an introvert, and that part of my identity I hold so close that sometimes I use it as a crutch to say, hey, I'm an introvert, so I can't talk out, or I'm comfortable in small groups. So all I'm saying is, you're right. I mean, the identity of it, but in a group like this, I'm probably taking the mic for the third or the fourth time. So not really an introvert from that classic sense, right? So that's what the revelation is I'm sitting with. But thank you very much, Raghu. I think that's a fair point. It's not about multiple identities, but multiple ways of operating in a different context.
Yeah, just one small thing with that. Jung never talked about introvert and extrovert. He talked about introversion as possibilities. Pop psychologists have created introvert and extrovert and so on as things to fix you with.
So a lot of Western psychometrics that originate from there do tend to label, categorize, and put you into tight boxes for which you have no redemption because they're held in absolutism. Ankit, Raghu has magically disappeared.
I think he's joining back. It's also time. So move towards closing. Yes, Steve.
No, do you want to share about the recordings or anything from your side?
Yeah. So 3 logistical things. Of course, you'll all get the recording by tomorrow, if not today. We'll also share the interest forms for the Manthan sometimes in October or November. And if some of you would like to start engaging with this work more and have some questions, would like some readings, you're always welcome to respond to the email and we can take it from there. All right.
And we're also committed.
Sorry, go on, please.
Committed to further dialogue because we think it's extremely important. Even if 5 people, 6 people come, we'll be quite happy to engage in a dialogue.
Yeah. Somebody was sharing something.
Siddharth.
Vinti, yes.
logistics question, Ankit. What I wanted to know was, would it be okay to share the recording ahead with
Yes, absolutely. Public
other
event.
people in other spaces?
Yes, Venki, absolutely.
Thank you.
Shall we say Jai Hind and close, Ankit?
Yes, we can close here. Thank you very much, everyone. Maybe
Okay,
we can...
bye everyone.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The recording has stopped.
Who's this Uncle Fathom?
No, this you can leave. This is mine.
How does it come? I saw mine was a name. Oh, really? But it had my pic.
He had your pic?
Okay.
Really?
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Okay. ठीक है. हाँ.
With us and all that, and this was supposed to be